Hello and welcome to this webinar, Morocco at a Crossroads, Youth Mobilization, Political Reform and Regional Geopolitics, organized by the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., as part of our coverage of the politics, economics, society of the Middle East and North Africa and US foreign policy towards the region. My name is Daniel Neep. I'm the senior editor at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to moderate this webinar today. We are going to be focusing on three areas of Moroccan politics today. The first is the surge of youth-led demonstrations that swept Morocco from late September to mid-October this year because of unemployment, healthcare inequities, declining public services, and government unresponsiveness. A lot of the international discussion has focused on the fact this is Generation Z involved in protests for the first time, and the fact that they've used new platforms to organize their discontent, platforms such as Discord. For those of us who remember 2010 and 2011, the question is whether this use of Discord is any different from how people, a previous generation, used Facebook. One of the questions we think about today is whether this translates to a new type of protest, a new type of political activity, or if it's just a revival of very familiar dynamics of protest and contestation. The second question we're going to be thinking about is how does the local population regard Morocco's foreign policy? And there are two key factors in this respect. The first is the fact that Morocco normalized relations with Israel in 2020. And even since the recent announcement of the ceasefire in Gaza, flights between Israel and Morocco have begun to start again. How do ordinary Moroccans respond to this? And how consequential is public opinion in this respect? The second foreign policy issue is, of course, Morocco's ongoing efforts to have the international community recognize its claims to sovereignty over the Western Sahara. This long-running conflict has recently taken a new turn after Morocco won the backing of the Trump administration in its second term. Last month, UN Resolution 2797, reaffirming the mandate of the UN mission on Western Sahara, also called for the first time for negotiations on the basis of Morocco's 2007 autonomy proposal with a view to achieving a final and mutually acceptable political solution for self-determination for the people of Western Sahara. So how do these changing domestic and foreign policy dynamics feed into the current political context, and how will they feed into the elections that are scheduled to take place in 2026? With us today, we have three speakers who are going to help us understand the crossroads that Morocco is currently at. I'm going to introduce each of them in turn. Our first speaker will be Samia Errazzouki, who is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Department of History at Stanford University and a former Morocco-based journalist. I should point out that Samia is also the author of our latest policy analysis that we published here at ACW, entitled Morocco at Breaking Point: Drought, Misrule, and the Rise of Generation Z 212. So Samia, I'll hand over to you as our first speaker.
Thank you very much for having me. So I want to sort of begin by pointing out and reiterating a point that Daniel made earlier, which is that it is my belief that these protests are very much a continuation of previously articulated demands. First, in 2011, with the February 20th movement in Morocco's version of the Arab Spring, and then 2017 with the Hirak movement in the Rif. I can talk about these two protests more in depth in the Q&A, but just throwing that out for context. And so in that sense, I think it's important to understand that the protests that are unfolding right now in Morocco have less to do with the generational shift and more to do with the question of the failures of governance and the fact that previously articulated grievances have not been addressed. So in terms of the recent protests that have been unfolding in Morocco since the end of September, there are two major events that I think are important to highlight with regard to sort of what were the immediate sparks. The first was that throughout the month of August in the city of Agadir in the Sousse region in the south, there were a number of deaths in the maternity ward of Hassan II Hospital. 8 women died due to birth-related complications within the span of 10 days. So one can imagine, right? This growing sort of anger and frustration, especially amongst the local community, intending and planning to go to the hospital to celebrate new birth, having to instead prepare and make funeral arrangements. And images soon began to surface showing the condition, the state of this hospital. Images that for many in the rural regions of Morocco could relate if they have even a hospital to begin with. So this was sort of one of the most immediate sparks that began fueling protests. This is happening in Agadir now, about 1,000 kilometers to the north, in the city of Al Hoceima. Nasser Zefzafi, who was a leader of the Hirak protest movement in 2017, was granted provisional humanitarian release to attend his father's funeral. So when he was released, soon enough, he delivered remarks to a large crowd that gathered in front of his family home. And the day ended with massive, spontaneous crowd and protest of people demanding his permanent release. It's important to note that with Nasser Zefzafi, his role and his presence in the recent political history of Morocco is super important because the Hirak movement was one of the only protest movements in recent times in Morocco to have a leader. Okay, so he has been serving a 20-year prison sentence. And so you have the confluence of these two events, what's happening in Agadir, what's happening in Hoceima. And then in mid-September, a group of anonymous individuals came together on the app Discord. Now, just because the app becomes this sort of mobilizing force, I think is important to note that it's not to be attributed solely to that, though it does offer alternative ways for the youth and those that were involved with the protest movement to organize, because these are technological sort of developments that the state really hasn't caught up with. Discord, as those of you may know, is an app that is used for gamers to communicate. And within a matter of days, those that were on this Discord channel decided that the time was ripe to take action. And soon the Discord channel grew exponentially to the thousands. I just checked a few days ago. It's about 250,000 now. And we can talk a little bit about what the structure and sort of what the nature of this Discord channel is, because I think that's super fascinating as well. It's not just limited to questions of political change. So the protests were set. It was decided that there was going to be several spontaneous protests taking place throughout Morocco. And that happened September 27th. Now, what was unique about these protests, the Gen Z 212 protests, 212, sort of in reference to Morocco's country code, is that they were consecutive. Okay, so the February 20th movement protests unfolded on a weekly basis. With the Hirak movement, similarly on a weekly basis. With the Gen Z 212 movement, we're seeing protests every single night. And by the third night, we are beginning to see escalation. And eventually, 3 protesters get killed by authorities, prompting even further outrage. Now, what we see in response to this is a page out of the playbook, which is a combination of repression. Over 2,000 people ended up getting arrested and charged. And then we see the king deliver a speech. Now, the speech that he delivered in Parliament was previously scheduled. He delivers it every year to mark the opening of the parliamentary session, and he just avoided addressing the question of the protest or even addressing their demands directly. But one could read in between the lines to see that the main sort of topic at hand that the king was addressing was this question of healthcare, public healthcare, youth unemployment, and addressing urban and rural disparities. So this is sort of the immediate current situation. I wanted to just spend some time talking about some of the underlying crises that I think are important to mark and have gone somewhat unaddressed, I think, in mainstream media coverage on these protests. And the 3 points that I want to talk about are the ongoing drought, the aftermath of the pandemic, and the recent 2023 earthquake in Morocco, all of which carried huge humanitarian cost in terms of death. So we're talking about thousands and thousands that have died through the accumulation of these three crises. What they all share is that these crises are not necessarily right beyond the immediate control of the state. These are natural ecological crises that unfolded. Though what I want to argue here is that at each of these moments, at each of these crises, the state was the state had an opportunity to address the major core structural issues at hand, the ones that are articulated in the Gen Z who went to protest, as well as the Hirak movement, as well as the February 20th movement. But yet at every turn of these crises, we are seeing a failure of governance. So with the drought, right, Morocco's been undergoing the worst drought in decades. Okay, so this is important when considering the economic situation in Morocco. The agricultural sector is the primary source of employment in the country. And as of at least 2024, the wheat harvest in Morocco was cut by half. And knowing what the wheat harvest is going to be is a major indicator for what the GDP is going to be for the following year. So because of that being cut in half, then we can directly connect that with the economic indicators. And this has also led to a day-to-day change of ordinary life in Morocco. In the past Eid al-Adha holiday, the king encouraged and dissuaded Moroccans from making the sacrifice, the slaughter, which was the first time he's ever done that in his whole entire reign. This is a major sort of, for that to sort of be what the Moroccans are hearing from their head of state does not really inspire confidence. In addition to a number of other issues, access to water has been severely limited and stifled. People are experiencing shutoffs. Water pressure is low. And even the hammams, the public baths in Morocco, have been forced to cut down how often they're open, cutting it down by 3 days a week. So that's number one. And then the second is obviously the pandemic. Now, Morocco, like other countries, experienced a lockdown, imposed various measures to prevent the spread of coronavirus. But Morocco's response was particularly carceral. Okay, so by the end of the height of the pandemic, the Ministry of Interior itself reported that they had arrested 1.5 million people due to violating lockdown-related restrictions. So that compounded with the 16,000 deaths sort of gives us a sense that rather than deal with this humanitarian crisis using humanitarian measures and social policy, there was instead a deployment of the security apparatus and security institution, which then goes into the earthquake. So September 2023, we had a major earthquake, 6.8, that hit the House region and the High Atlas. Over 3,000 dead. One of the most devastating earthquakes in recent Moroccan history. The last happened in Al Hoceima in 2006, and before that, folks will probably recall 1960, the devastating earthquake of Agadir. This is to say that earthquakes, Morocco's prone to earthquakes, right? And it's not sort of lost on us that the areas and the regions of Morocco that are hit the hardest with earthquakes are the ones that are the most isolated, the ones that are lacking in infrastructure, the most basic of infrastructure, which makes providing emergency response efforts super difficult. This, right, again, we're seeing a natural ecological crisis compounded by this man-made crisis of poor governance. So with the earthquake, for example, it took about 24 hours for the government to even convene an official meeting of the cabinet to begin outlining emergency response measures because they had to wait the king's arrival from Paris. This gives us a sense of how bureaucracy and every aspect of decision-making is at a standstill, which feeds right to this question of authoritarian resilience that has happened in Morocco. And these three crises together I argue, are important for us to make sense of the protests that are happening right now in Morocco. That though we are seeing this sort of youthful spirit unfolding and galvanized and energetic, that what they are articulating, their grievances are not new. Uh, they are underlying causes that are beyond the control of the government, though the government has proven to be um, mm, lacking in its ability to meet basic needs. And this is contrasted by the fact that Morocco is preparing to host first the African Cup of Nations in December and then the World Cup in 2030. And recently, they just opened up, inaugurated this massive stadium that was renovated in Rabat. Um, and this is not lost on Moroccans. This is on top of additional major mega projects. If folks go to Rabat, they will see there is the Mohammed VI Tower, supposedly the tallest building in Africa, the Zaha Hadid designed opera house, the largest opera house in Africa, which remains unopened to the public. These are just sort of uh, glimpses into the misplaced attention on development and projects in Morocco that have increased the rural regions' marginalization. And what I argue is that what we are seeing today, even though the protests have been temporarily suspended and halted to reorganize, according to the movement organizers, because there's no leaders, that even if the protests do cease, that what will come in the future will not differ and perhaps even intensify. What we're seeing is an increased frequency of protests. Um, and I think that signals to us a lack of uh, willingness to accept the status quo in Morocco, especially as the stakes get higher. And more importantly, as we're entering a period of transition with clearly efforts being made to elevate the crown prince to more public facing roles as his father sort of retreats. And so this is sort of the broader picture. And I think that hopefully that has sort of provided some sort of insight into the recent developments in Morocco that cuts through the noise and opens up the possibility for looking at this through more structural and deep angles. So looking forward to discussing more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Samia. I'm going to follow up with a quick question, if I may. I think you did, you explained very clearly how the impact of the drought, the earthquake, of COVID, the impact is not felt evenly across the population. But the repercussions of these ecological and epidemiological crises are actually they overlap with pre-existing social divisions. You talked about the rural-urban divide. You talked about lack of infrastructure and healthcare. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that question, this question of, I guess, geography and the fact that there is this geographical unevenness in how development is played out in Morocco? You mentioned the biggest, Africa's biggest opera house, at the same time as you have parts of the country that don't have necessarily access to electricity and water. Could you explain a little bit more about these spatial dynamics and how they may overlap with other historical or identity-based expressions as well? And also, I'm curious to know what else people are talking about on Discord.
Yes, so I think one of the most insightful examples is looking at the railroad system in Morocco. So the railway system is one that was built by the French when Morocco was under French colonialism. Now, this effectively connects all of the major urban areas in Morocco, ending in Marrakesh. Okay, now there's so much more of the country beyond Marrakesh. And as far north as Tangier. This railroad infrastructure curiously is built around the facilitation and the movement of certain resources, namely phosphate, from Khribga to Casablanca. But the rest of the country remains isolated from it. Now, well after Morocco gained independence in 1956. Now we're in 2025. The most recent change and upgrading of the railroad system in Morocco has simply been to make it faster. Okay, so there's been this revamping of the train with the high-speed rail, but it still ends in Marrakesh. Now, to sort of isolate a huge portion of the country that is at the core of providing Morocco with its labor force and its raw material, I think replicates historical modes of governance and dominance that were colonial. And part of that has also been this imposition and implementation of a divide that alienates not just these people in the rural areas who also happen to be ethnically distinct from those that were in power after independence in Morocco, these state-led Arabization policies. The vast majority of those in the rural areas are indigenous Amazigh, the indigenous population of North Africa. So they are doubly, triply alienated, if we can think of it that way. So the railroad system is just one way to think of it. This extends to so many other aspects of infrastructure. The highway system, though it's beginning to sort of expand, though I still recall during my journalism days, if a place was 300 kilometers away, that didn't necessarily mean equal distance in terms of travel time, depending on where it is. Because I could easily get to a place that was connected to the highway within 2-3 hours. But if that was in the Reef region or the Atlas, that is a question of 7, 8, 9, 10 hours, even more. And as you noted, there are places in the high Atlas and other parts of the country, they do not have running water and electricity. And I think this is both a cause of and a contributing factor to this cycle of further and further stoking this divide and essentially just entirely alienating the rural part of the country. And then the Discord channel, I mean, it was fascinating to me. I look into it every now and then, but it's not just, it's organized around regions, for example, which is interesting. We're kind of seeing a replication of state organization, the 12 regions of Morocco. And then we also have different channels that are used for different themes and conversations and topics. I mean, it's not just all political. There's like one that's about, you know, a history channel, just learning and discussing history. There are groups that integrate the Moroccan diaspora. It's actually extremely fascinating and illuminating to sort of look at this as how, you know, what the future of a sort of a Moroccan communal identity may look like with these kids. I think it's very inspiring.
That's super interesting. I find it intriguing that young Moroccans are turning back to this kind of forum-based approach to discussion, one that seems to me reminiscent of the internet circa 2006, 2007, before it was taken over by big corporations and apps and so forth. But that's an aside. Thank you, Samia. Let's turn to our second speaker. Our second speaker today is Mohamed Daadaoui, who is Professor of Political Science at Oklahoma City University. Mohamed is the author of Moroccan Monarchy and the Islamist Challenge and has published widely on Morocco and multi-party coalition government politics across North Africa more generally. So we'll turn to you next, Mohamed. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Samia, of course, for your eloquent discussion intervention there. I want to shout out to my comparative politics class. They're attending this webinar as well. So shout out to my students, undergraduate students there. I thought I'll do something, similar to Samia, but also different in highlighting also the political nuances in how the protests have been dealt by the government response. So I wanted to talk about what's behind the protests, why these protests matter, and highlighting some of the duality in terms of regime and state perception by the Moroccans as well, which is very important in understanding the trajectory of this protest and future protest and trajectory of the reforms in the country. Morocco's Gen Z 212, as Samia said, protests are yet another episode, I would call it, in the series of protests that have been rampant in Morocco since 2012. These are protests, boycotts that extend all the way to the Reef protest, Jirada, the boycotts, Imidder, the online boycotts too, which also include in this category because they are what we call digital age activism, a form of activism. And they are more than a moment of youth frustration and angst. They are indications of something deeper, that youth expect more in Morocco than just symbolic reform, symbolic investment, occasional subsidies by the government, and that there is a huge demand and void for that basic public services. And that government has been largely unresponsive. And that's why you see this sporadic episode of these protests, jumping and popping up in Morocco since 2012. For the government, this is yet another test for legitimacy, of legitimacy. There is a waning sense of trust, eroding sense of trust between the government and the people. And it is for them an opportunity to take on major reforms. But again, there is a lack of political will. But for the public, it is also an opportunity to reshape priorities. And these priorities continue to be centered around several interlocking grievances that we see fueling these protests in late September and October, like the public service collapse, the outrage, as Samia indicated, over the a tragic incident where 8 pregnant women died in hospital in Agadir. There's also this lack of thorough cutting investment in education, in the job market creation. I think a lot of us know that youth unemployment is very high. Estimates range between 35 to all 40, depending on the source, %, especially for graduates with promises that remain unmet and unrealized by job creation. And there is the other more timely reasons, such, for example, the massive spending in terms of infrastructure that are geared towards global visibility. Samia enumerated some of those in Rabat, the 2030 World Cup, the AFCON soccer tournament that is coming up in next month. Which again, I said it before the meeting, the webinar, and I was talking to Samia and Daniel about it, that seems to me that there is this duality in terms of perception of Morocco, that there is one Morocco that is marketed for the outside visibility, for global visibility, and you have this, tremendous infrastructure and it's spending infrastructure in major urban settings and urban area, whereas the hinterlands, the rural areas are not benefiting from the same largesse of the state. And then there is that other part of Morocco, the deep Morocco, that is largely alienated and not so much cared for by the governments, and the people are seeing that day in and day out. So these protests encapsulate a lot of these grievances and repackage them yet again in another leaderless movement, youth-generated movement, Gen Z 212, and Morocco Youth Voice as well, that emerged through Discord, TikTok, Instagram, X, which gave it, these digital age activism, like always the case. It gives it this amorphous type of leadership. It's a non-movement leaderless movements that are really difficult for the government to, even if they want to negotiate with them, to negotiate with. It's difficult for them to contain. But the advantage of these activists or digital activists as well is that they have the ability to and agility to project and to organize these protests and over a diffuse structure and in a democratized, vastly democratized space, which is social media. So what began as localized frustration was over failing of public services expanded to national movement. And there were two things that caught my attention during the protest. There were the protests that were called for by the General Z movement that were largely peaceful, vast majority of peaceful, civilized, I would say, if I can use the word. And then there were the other ones that after the protests after even Gen Z called for the protests to end for that particular day. And you have these individuals, I would call them hooligans, agents provocateurs, if you want, that came out in the dark of night and committed acts of violence against public property, private property, acts of looting, and so on. And that diminished, if you want, the legitimacy, not legitimacy of the demands, but the legitimacy of the protest. And I'll come back to that later on. What these protests also highlight is that this is also important for us to distinguish between regime and state in Morocco. A regime, the political order, the monarchy, the state is the government, what we call it the makhzen, if you want, the state apparatus, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. These protests have been directed at the state and the government, and it was clear from the very beginning that they were not directed at the monarch. If anything, they were directed at the Abdelaziz bin Akhnouch, who is the prime minister, the head of the government, and by the way, is also the third wealthiest person in Morocco after the king and Ben Jelloun is the second one. And even actually Gen Z towards the end, I would say the week before the regularly scheduled speech, King's speech before the parliament, there was a public plea and list of demand by Gen Z movement to the king, to sack the prime minister, to actually have a form. I didn't understand that part, but a public trial of corrupt officials and so on, right? And when I saw it, I thought it was, I didn't think, not that I'm good at prediction, but I didn't think the king would address it, because I think the tone was not the usual tone that you would see when people are asking things from the king. It was a little bit of dry. It was, almost peer-to-peer tone. And I knew that the monarchical establishment, as confident still, because I'm still bullish on the regime and so on, probably to the opposite of Samia maybe, and Riccardo will see. But it reflects that this is a confident monarchy. It's a monarchy that's still in control of the state, of the affairs of the state, and so on. They were not fazed by the protest. And it was clear to me that even during the speech itself, as Samia outlined, the king did not really talk about the Gen Z, did not talk about the reforms, did not talk about the protest at all. What he talked about instead is this attempt that he asked the politicians attempt to explain their role and to project and to project a sense of citizen, a politician, more solid relationship, with their constituency, right? And I think those are, largely, I would say, reconciliatory, gestures, short of talking directly to the Gen Zers themselves, right? But largely address the responsibility of legislators and the government, not so much, what the government itself, what the regime can do, because we all know in Morocco, it's not the government, but it's the regime that controls, and the palace advisors, and what we call the shadow government, or some call the shadow government. These are the ones that control the affairs of the state. It's not the government of Akhnouch and so on and so forth. So he did not address the Gen Z movement directly, nor did he acknowledge their plea for intervention. And to me, those are the actions of a confident regime, because if you contrast them and juxtapose those to what the government and the regime did after let's say the February 28th movement in 2012, in the aftermath of the Arab uprising and tsunami of the Arab uprisings, I think then the regime was rattled a little bit. They felt that, hey, next door we're getting people losing, their posts, our heads of states and so on. There is a general sense of civil strife. And what the king at that time did, gave a speech, head-on addressed the reforms, in a cosmetic fashion, symbolic fashion. Establish a blue ribbon palace commission that rewrote the constitution, acknowledged in the Amazigh language, and so on. So give what we call these symbolic kind of concessions, if you want, to the movement. We did not see that with the Gen Z movement 212 protest. And I think some of it also had to do with the timing of the protest. The Gen Z 212 movement, I think it just didn't the timing was off for them. It's not their fault. I mean, it just coincided with two things. One of them, some people think it's probably not that important. I think it's important, knowing how football, soccer, because we know this is an American audience predominantly, how football, soccer mad the country is, right? Which was the under-20 World Cup victory. People went in the streets, jubilant, right? They quickly tend to forget about, these legitimate grievances, socio-economic grievances. And then, of course, I think the straw, I would say, that broke the camel's back for now, because I think the protest is not going anywhere. It just, as Samia said, is suspended for now to regroup, to recalibrate their strategy and so on. But that was the United Nations Security Council 2797 on the autonomy plan in the Western Sahara, right? And you see the same thing. People didn't go in the streets. Granted, of course, these are God sent. What I say, these are, momentous events, because they were God sent to the regime, the state, the media, and so on, to actually reshape the narrative and cast it that as a moment of elation, nationalism, patriotism, as it is, because there is a tremendous source of jubilation, I would say, and national patriotism when it comes to Morocco's territorial integrity, when it comes to the Western Sahara and Saharan provinces. And that's something that the regime knows. And, they dubbed it, through the media and so on, as a historic by state media, and all eager to shift, as I said before, the narrative and focus away, turn it away from socioeconomic, challenges. So indeed, we joke that in the month of October, it was an odd one. It was a weird one for Moroccan. In 1 month, we went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, from angst and anger and burning and violence and so on, to elation and people making amends with the police and whatnot, give roses to the police. This is the police that were repressing them, not a week or two before that. So, but that is the state of the Morocco, and I think it's because the regime is still in charge, I would say. Having said that, I don't want to end on a bullish, optimistic note. What I see increasingly is that also at the same time that we're seeing a confident regime, we see also that an erosion of this king dilemma. And it's not, as I said before, Huntington's dilemma. And when I wrote about it in the past, I look at king dilemma as the ability of the king to portray themselves above the political fray while still managing the political system and civil society. I don't think this duality of strategy of appearing above and at the same time managing the micro dynamics of the political system in Morocco is working and won't work in the long run, because there is a blurring of that thin line between the monarchy and the government. The palace is increasingly subject to direct scrutiny. And I think the speech was an opportunity to maintain that line as thick as it could, but I think it failed in doing so. So my conclusion for this is that this is more of the same of what we say, of what I see in Morocco. These are protests that we're going to see. It's not going to be the end of the protests, but we're also going to see the same kind of symbolic gestures, promises of reforms, but no meaningful, deep-cutting reforms, certainly not in the context of democratic governance in Morocco. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up with a quick question in that case. Given what you've outlined about the strength of the monarchy, the strength of the regime in Morocco, and given its ability to rally public support, around these great symbols of nationalism, this national identity you were talking about, are we going to have, and given the regime is, as you said, isn't really going to push forward necessarily with any reforms, what impact will these protests have over the coming year politically? Will there actually be any political impact? I'm curious to know if there might be some repercussions for the upcoming 2026 elections. You talked about how the current prime minister, this billionaire Aziz Akhnouch, who's one of the richest men in Africa as well as not just Morocco.
Yeah.
And his wife, I understand, is a businesswoman in her own right. I can see how they kind of symbolize the economic inequality within Morocco. But will the Prime Minister's party retain its support, do you think, in the next election? Or do you think that the Islamist party, the party of Justice and Development, might stage some kind of comeback? Of course, they lost a lot of support in 2021. Their share in parliament plummeted. Is there any way in which the Islamists or other political parties might actually be able to ride the back of the protest and translate that popular protest into some kind of electoral gain?
Well, it's a very good questions and comments there. I think, you're answering some of those questions as well. You're asking political scientists here to kind of give predictions and prognostics, and we're really not that good at them, right? We're always terrible at predicting anything. But I could probably venture a guess, I would say, if I may, is that in the next election, there will be some ramifications for this protest. I mean, the king did send a message to the politicians now, in indirect form that, you got to mind your job, do it seriously, and so on, that there are people that depend on this project, that these are projects of importance and national interest and national security importance for the country. What you would see, I don't think you're going to see in Morocco a time in which one party has the whole majority, because something I wrote about in the past as well is this electoral engineering of the elections. There's no one party that's going to get the majority. You're going to have a coalition of the unwilling, I would say, right? These parties from different ideologies coalescing together in order to make a government, and they make a government based on the distribution of resources, something that we talk here about in the United States, the distribution of pork. I can't say pork in Morocco being a Muslim country, but the distribution of resources among the different parties, basically how the distribution of cabinet portfolios, other than the portfolios of sovereignty, like religious affairs and the habus and the ministry and so on and so forth. And those are usually reserved for the monarchy. Whether it's the PJD or not, I think the PJD will have some form of role in there. I know they have regrouped since the shellacking in 2012. Now, part of that is not their own doing as well. I think there was some type of machinations from the government. There was some what we call blocage at that time, in which I think there was an attempt by the regime to block the way of Ben Kiran. Abdelilah Ben Kiran, I should say, the former prime minister and the current head of PJD. He left and he came back as well, not to set up the government and so on, because at that time Ben Kiran was becoming a little bit more populist, more popular, maybe, dare I say, than those that are in the regime. So I think there was some attempt there to, break his momentum, right? So I think there was some electoral, engineering in that as well. But it will be more of the same. The monarchy is really good at recycling political parties to fit whatever challenges and problems they are facing and tests they are facing. I won't think Akhnouche would be, if I have to be the guest, and I'm sure like by September next year, Riccardo and Samia and Daniel will text me, whatever, and tell me you're wrong. I don't think Akhnouche is going to be prime minister in September, if I'm going to be bold about that, right? I think it's going to be a coalition of government. His party is going to be there in the mix, maybe, but it's going to be somebody else. Because this, I'm just basing this based on the trajectory of the recycling of political parties that we've had since the 1980s, if you want, 1970s, 1980s. We see this pattern of putting different prime ministers or leaders of the government at different times to face these challenges. And I'll let you, because I know Riccardo has a lot to say as well. And as far as the protests themselves, and I think the importance of these periodic episodes of protests is that they reshape the priorities for the government as well. It's not that they are oblivious and they are blind to them and they don't deal with some aspect of them, of these grievances. Is that the sheer size of the development and needs in Morocco are huge. And actually something that we talked about and Samia alluded to in your question, Daniel, Morocco, it doesn't actually have a bad economic growth. I mean, in the last quarter, it was what, 5.5, 6%, somebody help me. I mean, it's not terrible. The problem is what Samia said is bad governance, corruption, clientelism, crony predatory capitalism. These are the things that are offset that economic growth from trickling down and seeing it all over the place, not just in the urban centers that the tourists see and so on and so forth. So hopefully I'm not going over my time.
Thank you so much. For those of you listening at home, I'd like to mention that we will be taking questions from the audience. You can send your question to us using the question and answer feature on Zoom, or you can also email your questions to us at events@arabcenterdc.org. That's events@arabcenterdc.org. So please do send us your questions via Zoom or by email, and we'll be turning to some of those after our third and final speaker today. Our third speaker is Riccardo Fabiani, who is North Africa Project Director at the International Crisis Group. So Riccardo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks a lot, most importantly, to Samia and Mohamed for their excellent and very interesting presentations. I think since they've really covered extremely well the domestic political dynamics, I think it makes sense for me maybe to focus more on the political economy, I guess, of the country, and most importantly, the foreign policy aspects of contemporary Morocco. And I want to start from what Mohamed just said, which I thought it was interesting because I think it's very true and almost, I would say, kind of commonplace these days to start any kind of discussion on Morocco by saying that it stands out as an exception in the region due to its, relatively good growth rate, which is very true, its forward-looking developmental policy. And it's true that the jury is obviously still out whether this approach will work out in the end or not. It will take years, but for the time being, there have been notable achievements, right, in various sectors, from the automotive industry to the renewable energy sector, and the authorities have been very keen to promote all of this, both domestically and internationally. At the same time, we also know that this process, this developmental process, is also predicated on a very delicate and contradictory political economy arrangement, right? In the monarchy directs, in a way, controls to a large extent its network of cronies, of patronage networks across the country to implement the vision that it sets out for the government and everyone in the country to implement. But at the same time, it's true that the authorities and the throne itself is very much fundamentally reluctant to upset the status quo, right? A clear example of this is the complete lack of competition in a large number of domestic sectors, whether it's retail, whether it's transportation, sectors that basically the authorities have no interest in opening up or making more competitive, despite the fact that everyone knows that this has a cost on the country overall. And I think this has been made very much clear by many, especially international institutions. And this is the contradiction, right, that is at the heart of the Moroccan model, if there is a model, so to speak. I would say that obviously Al-Khanouch in a way embodies, right, this massive contradiction, the conflict of interests that are very much at play in his appointment have not been addressed. And again, the institutions of the country and the monarchy in the first place has no desire to really tackle this issue. Of course, this is not the only issue, right? There are other shortcomings, whether we're talking about, for example, education being one. But this is, I would say, a fundamental weakness, right, that has really undermined, to an extent, Morocco's relatively good economic results, right? It has, most importantly, prevented the rise of a broad-based class of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs from emerging, from becoming not just an economic actor in their own right, but also a political actor in their own right. And what is interesting is how the Gen Z protests have also partly shed the light once again on this contradiction, once again, because as Samia and Mohamed have said very well, this is not the first time that these kind of protests happen, and these issues have been bubbling up regularly in Moroccan recent history. Now, having said all of this, what is also clear at the same time is that the authorities have no intention whatsoever to really challenge or trying to tackle this developmental conundrum, right? Instead, what we have seen in the past few years, regardless of the 2011 protests, the Haraka Rif, the various reporting on these issues, the authorities have been doubling down on the idea of big investment projects that are meant to level up the country's attractiveness, to boost its competitiveness. But there's also an interesting element that has really emerged more recently that I want to focus on here, which is that there is a growing emphasis on the part of the Moroccan authorities on economic multi-alignment. And I think this is interesting because it applies both to the economic sphere, but also to Morocco's foreign policy. I would say that, in a nutshell, the kingdom here is really making a major bet on its ability to take advantage of what we can define the growing disgregation, or effectively the growing regionalization of globalization, right? The globalization is effectively breaking down into a series of regional blocks, and Morocco seems to believe that it can place itself at the intersection of multiple economic areas that include Europe, the US, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, and even to a lesser extent, Latin America and Russia. And there is a gamble here, right? That the gamble is that Morocco's transactional, deal-minded foreign policy can carve a unique niche in all these trade wars for Morocco to exploit, right? And for Morocco effectively to become a hub, an energy hub for Europe in terms of renewable production, and possibly in the future even gas supply through the Nigeria-Morocco gas pipeline, a hub for manufacturing, whether it's European firms or Chinese firms basing themselves in Morocco, a logistical hub, right, through not just Tangier Med, but also Nador West Med, whether it's a logistical hub for American, European, and African markets. And of course, we know that some of Morocco's partners are already grumbling and are not particularly happy about this kind of approach, Europe being probably the most, until now, vocal critic of this approach. They don't like, for example, the fact that there is a new Chinese gigafactory being built in Kenitra these days. And most importantly, Morocco is quietly pivoting towards the Chinese electric vehicles industry, because there seems to be an understanding in Rabat that that's the future, right? And it's no longer necessarily just Peugeot and the European car factory industry, the future for the country. And what emerges, and what I think it's very interesting here, what emerges is that Morocco really has an extraordinary ability to position itself as, in this sort of multi-alignment world that we're looking at, as an indispensable partner, almost an exception, right? Morocco always portrays itself and markets itself as the exception in an otherwise unreliable and dangerous region, full of instability and problems. And the idea is that they are willing to talk business with whichever international partner, as long as its core interests are left untouched, right? And these core interests, of course, include Western Sahara being, I would say, the number one core interest in Moroccan foreign policy, but also economic sovereignty is becoming gradually one of them. And this is a framing that I would say the Moroccan authorities are have really become particularly good at imposing on their foreign partners, or at least at making the foreign partners accept, right? Of course, it doesn't apply in the same way to all the partners. And this, I think it's a crucial distinction. When it comes to Europe, Morocco is being, I would say, exceptionally skillful at exploiting the issue of interdependence, right? If you're looking at Morocco from Europe, as I do right now, one effectively just can only wonder which one is the actor that has more leverage. Is it Europe or is it Morocco, right? Rabat tends to have a much more coherent approach to its bilateral relationship with Europe in general, with any of the European, the EU member states. It knows its strengths and weaknesses. It has become very capable of taking advantage of Europe's own divisions and its own weaknesses. And Rabat is, I would say, only too happy to continue to increase the interdependence with Europe, because it plays to its own advantage, right? We can think about migration, we can think about security, but in the long term, we can also think about, as I said, energy, right? And the green transition. Morocco is very happy to position itself as one of the key pieces in Europe's future energy puzzle. The same approach doesn't necessarily apply to other more coherent, maybe, or more distant interlocutors, right? If you look at the US, Morocco is obviously learning to use the porous institutions that make up the American democracy. It's trying to use these institutions to its advantage, right? And there's an interesting cooperation taking place in DC these days with the UAE and also Israel and their respective lobbying networks that I think to an extent is proving helpful for Morocco's own interest. But there is at the same time a certain caution, right, on Rabat's side. They know that they need to exercise some restraint when dealing with Washington, right, because there is not the same level of interdependence that it has with Europe. At the same time, Morocco is still very good at getting what it wants from the US, and particularly this administration has its own specific features. Now, China and Russia are obviously a very different story, right? The interdependence there is minimal, first of all, and the coherence of these actors, I would say, is much stronger, right? This limits a lot Morocco's ability to maneuver around them. And that's when we tend to see a more subdued and careful Morocco, right? At the same time, these countries also know that they don't really have an interest in clashing with Morocco necessarily. And Morocco is very good also at trying to, accommodate their limited investment and interest in the countries. And just to finish my hopefully short overview here, this multi-alignment strategy is obviously most evident in the case of Western Sahara, right? And we mentioned this multiple times over the past few minutes. We've seen it in the resolution that has been approved by the UN Security Council, how Morocco has been able to turn completely around the approach of the UK, France, and the US, the three permanent members of the Security Council that it needed. And it also effectively mounted a campaign that was initially very effective because the first draft of the resolution had a very favorable language to Morocco. Eventually, it did hurt against the opposition of Russia and China. Yet, I would say the resolution itself continues to have a language that can only be described as a victory from the Moroccan perspective. It defines the autonomy proposal as basis or a most feasible solution. In any case, the autonomy plan is now the centerpiece of the UN approach to Western Sahara, and there are no questions around that. Even though it doesn't define the autonomy as the only solution, right? There is a slight gap, and I think it's interesting to point this out, a slight gap between the official rhetoric of the Moroccan authorities and the diplomatic reality that is the product of these consultations and this vote at the UN. I would argue, as I think Mohamed has already said, that the rhetoric that the authorities have really exploited in the aftermath of the approval of the resolution was also very much instrumental in facing the Gen Z protests that were obviously particularly active around the same time in Morocco, right? There was an attempt to mobilize the public opinion around this issue to also try and close ranks, if you like, faced with these other issues. Now, just to finish, what are the consequences of this? In the immediate term, of course, there is the possibility of a return to talks. The progress, I think, remains very unlikely on Western Sahara. The positions remain as distant as they were, but there has been an effort by the US administration and the UN envoy to try and create some space for the Polisario and Algerians to avoid losing face and yet join talks on Western Sahara. But I would argue that the long-term objective, the long-term strategy here pursued by Morocco is very different from this, right? There is, and this is something I've been talking about for a while and suspecting for a while, the end game here is not a deal on autonomy with the Polisario and Algeria. I think the Moroccans know very well that the Polisario will never accept that. This is not something that they can accept because of their constituencies, because of the nature of this organization. The end game here is to try and convince the international community that autonomy is the only solution, the only possible outcome or settlement of this conflict. And the emphasis here is not casual, right? The idea here is that if you create a solution that is, in the eyes of the international community, of every major actor in the international community, the only possible outcome, you end up in a situation where you can remove those actors that refuse to engage with the only possible solution and replace that actor, which is of course the Polisario, with a more, let's say, pragmatic or moderate or pro-Moroccan Sahrawi organization or Sahrawi representatives. And there are quite a few that could actually come in handy, let's say, from the Moroccan perspective. The real interest here from the Moroccan perspective is not really to end the conflict with the Polisario or with Algeria. Of course, there is an interest in restoring the bilateral relationship with Algeria, but the real interest here is to end the legal dimension of the Western Sahara conflict. The idea here is that Morocco needs a deal the deal that enables it to remove Western Sahara from the list of non-self-governing territories at the UN. Once you remove the legal dimension of the conflict from this equation, effectively the conflict from the Moroccan perspective is over, right? There is no real military activity on the ground. There is no threat to Moroccan interests or foreign interests in Western Sahara. And the Polisario is very much aware of this, right? They don't really have a credible alternative strategy, but they know that they're stuck. They're stuck between a rock, the rock of autonomy, and a hard place, which is the impossible military escalation given the regional context and given Morocco's military superiority over this. Of course, the key question here remains, and I end with this, whether Morocco will be capable in the next months and years to get what it wants, so an autonomy deal that it doesn't include necessarily the Polisario, without triggering accidentally whether an escalation or limited conflict with Algeria or the Polisario or other actors in the region. Thank you so much.
Riccardo, thank you for that. I am struck by one point you made, and I want to make sure that I've understood your argument accurately, because the way you reframed the recent UN resolution, I think, is quite important. You're saying it's a victory for Morocco, not because it really sets us up for a resolution politically of Western Sahara. And of course, the autonomy agreement is famously light on detail, right? The proposal that's been put forward. But the important thing is that it changes potentially the legal basis for dealing with Western Sahara in the future. By the idea being that this becomes there is a different legal trajectory once Western Sahara is taken off the UN Fourth Committee's list of territories that need decolonization. So it's a game changer in the long term, but not in the short term. Is that essentially? Have I understood that correctly?
I think that's right. I think that's right. Basically, in the short term, this resolution doesn't really change much. The language remains sufficiently vague for the Polisario and Algeria to claim that it doesn't impose autonomy as the only possible solution. So they can still, remain consistent with their own views that self-determination can only be exercised through a referendum, which is still the position of the Polisario and Algeria. But what the resolution does is that it creates another, I would say, brick, right? It adds another brick to the wall that Morocco is trying to build, which in the long term, they hope they will be complete, of course, and will be able to create the legal basis for the end of the conflict. And the legal basis for the end of the conflict is to make sure that at the UN, at every level of the UN, from the Security Council to the General Assembly and to the Fourth Committee, it is understood that the autonomy deal offered by Morocco is the only possible outcome, and there are no other options on the table, and nothing else can be contemplated. And therefore, now obviously add to this the fact that there is a bill at the U.S. Congress that wants to, where U.S. Congress, U.S. lawmakers want to designate the Polisario as a foreign terrorist organization, and there is this conversation going on in Congress around that. The idea here is that they can create the conditions for removing the Polisario from this equation, right? Removing the Polisario that is potentially in the future a foreign terrorist organization that refuses the only possible settlement for the conflict. So what you end up with is a completely different dynamic in terms of conflict resolution, in which Morocco can claim, as it has done for many years, that its own Sahrawi representatives in parliament and in the local councils, and other organizations, such as, for example, the Sahrawi Movement for Peace, which is a sort of offshoot of the Polisario led by a former Polisario official, and that it's an organization that has said very clearly that they want to discuss autonomy with Morocco. So the idea here is that Morocco can basically claim these are our only possible interlocutors, given that autonomy is the only possible resolution, and given that the Polisario is maybe a foreign terrorist organization designated by the US. So let's move ahead with this solution. Let's sign a deal with these actors, and so that we can finally go to the Fourth Committee and remove Western Sahara from the list of non-self-governing territories, because the autonomy deal signed with these organizations effectively is a way of exercising the territory's right to self-determination.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point to remember. my other question, Western Sahara, and I'm curious to know whether there is some kind of way in which the two strands of your presentation to come together here. Is there a way in which Morocco's economic strategies overlap with its foreign policy in Western Sahara? Is there any kind of, how does Western Sahara fit in with Morocco's plans for development, the kind of infrastructure development that Samia was talking about, plans to develop certain parts of the economy in the interest of global capital? Is there an intersection there, or is this very much a kind of old-fashioned question about territory?
No, I think, of course, at the core, it remains an old-fashioned, issue of territory, legitimacy, and so on, right? But it's definitely true that Morocco, over the past 10, 20 years, has drawn, I would say, a big lesson, right? That they need to make Western Sahara as attractive as possible to foreign capital and to foreign interests to make the status quo irreversible, right? And as I was mentioning before, and this really ties in the two parts of my presentation, right? The multi-alignment with the interdependence. Morocco understands very well that building and increasing and fostering interdependence with European firms and countries and the US and China and Russia and so on, it's a very key, I would say, passage in making sure that their interests are increasingly tied to Morocco's interest in Western Sahara. And a very good example of this is, for example, the green hydrogen projects that Morocco unveiled earlier this year. And most of them are based in Western Sahara, first of all. And you see a long list of companies from various countries around the world, right? It's the Gulf, it's Europe, it's China, and so on and so forth, right? All these countries are effectively tying their own interest in the development of green hydrogen, future development of green hydrogen, to the fact that Morocco is able to make these projects, of course, happen in Western Sahara, right? So effectively, what is happening is that Morocco is increasingly making sure that these countries will align, their interests are aligning with its own interest in Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, because their presence, their business interests, their interdependence is so tight that it has become almost a part, I would say, of the status quo. And this is how you see the multi-alignment and interdependence overlap with the old-fashioned, as you said, territorial issue of Western Sahara.
Excellent, thank you. For those of you viewing at home, please remember you can submit your questions to us using the question and answer function on Zoom, or email us at events@arabcenterdc.org. And I'm going to filter some of these questions through to our panelists right now. The first is really to connect the discussion about foreign policy with the discussion about the Gen Z 2-on-2 protests. So perhaps I could bring Samia or Mohamed back in. Is there any way in which these foreign policy issues are featuring in discussions that Gen Z is having at the moment? Did they feature at all in the protests and the debates people were having about politics? Or were those protests very much focused on these local domestic issues that you were both discussing?
Yeah, they're vastly domestic issues, as we said, and Samia said, socio-political grievances, domestically speaking. On the Western Sahara issue, I mean, you will not find many Moroccans, let's say, that are opposing the territorial integrity of the country and how Moroccan and the Moroccanity of the Sahara itself. It's the perennial issue, as Riccardo said, in foreign policy for a reason, because it's also a source of national pride and patriotism for Moroccans and throughout the years. And Morocco has been, it's not that they're just now investing in the region. They've been investing for decades, and billions and billions of dollars have been spent on the Western Sahara and what Moroccans call the Saharan provinces for a reason, right? Because in Morocco believe it's their own territory. They have legitimate, rights and claims, historically speaking, to it, and they've invested in it. And even the youth, when you speak in the street and whatnot, I mean, they shy away from discussing the Western Sahara issue, because to them, this is that's a source of national pride and national unity. There is a consensus on its Moroccanity for the Moroccans. And the West Sahara, I think, just in the context of this latest United Nations, I think it caps also a decade or so of Moroccan diplomacy. And I shared the point with Riccardo that it's a point of victory for Moroccans. They've done tremendous work at the micro level in Africa, I would say, in regional areas as well, to gather momentum for the recognition of that autonomy plan, because Morocco really believes that's the only plan. I mean, I agree with Riccardo. There is no other plan. There is not another universe in which Morocco would accept anything but an autonomy plan for a Saharan autonomous region, in which there is some type of negotiations, not with the Polisario, which makes sense why the Polisario should not be on the table of negotiations, because they are a rebel group that was set up by Algeria. We know that regionally speaking, this is a conflict between Algeria and Morocco. And even the king in his speech after the United Nations Security Council, he did speak directly to Algeria. He invited them again for, I don't know, the umpteenth time to come to the table of negotiations, because a path forward for the conflict would be through a bilateral negotiations between Morocco and Algeria, because that would be the culmination, if you want, of years and years of diplomacy on the Moroccan side, whereas Algerian side, to their chagrin, much to their chagrin, their diplomacy has been stagnant in the mode of 1970s and 90s. And as I think Riccardo alluded to it, Morocco has right now very, very strong allies. I mean, they have the United States, the Trump administration in the previous iteration in the first term acknowledged the sovereign rights of Morocco over the Western Sahara and so on. So they know that they can benefit from the backing of these superpowers, to the point that, as Riccardo stated, yes, we do have this bill in the United States Congress, which we get a debate whether Polisario should be considered a foreign terrorist organization, which would be a dead nail for the Polisario.
I also want to add here is, I think oftentimes in these conversations about Western Sahara, that the question of the refugees gets lost. So we're dealing with tens of thousands of refugees in Tindouf in southern Algeria. And I think this is one way to sort of answer your question in reverse, Daniel, which is that, at least I can recall from my visits to the refugee camps, is that one point that was articulated was that, what incentive do we have to accept the situation as it is in Morocco if we can see how the state and the regime is treating its own subjects, its own citizens? And so here I kind of want to refer to an argument that Moroccan journalist Abu Bakr Jamia has made a while back, is that, in fact, the Moroccan regime actually taking steps towards democratization and not just paying lip service to it, has also long-term benefits for other geopolitical and geostrategic interests, being that in democratizing, then there is an incentive to then say, well, any idea, any possibility of an autonomy plan will actually be beholden to certain checks and balances. As it stands, that's not the case.
If I may add to that, I mean, it just assumes that, yeah, well, Morocco is an authoritarian, let's say, state. But I mean, the Polisario is not any better. I mean, these people in the camps and whatnot, they face, in accordance to even Amnesty International, right, that they are prisoners of conscience there. They're not allowed freedom of movement. The Polisario does not allow the refugees. The refugees are in Algeria. They're not in Morocco proper. They're not allowing the refugees freedom of movement within or outside Algerian territory. Some of the camps we hear in reports are being decamped now because of the autonomy plan, because there are some movement, there was some celebration of the autonomy plan. They got decamped and they got put in jail. There are various violations of human rights in the camps themselves. It's not they are living there under like a democratic edifice in the camp either. So and we know that there are some people, if they're given the opportunity, right, they may want to move to Morocco, but they are not given that opportunity by the Polisario, proper. So I think it goes both ways, and that we need to monitor both sides when we talk about these claims for human rights abuses, authoritarianism, and so on. I'm not defending the regime in Morocco per se, but I mean we just have to have a little bit of parity in saying that the Polisario, they're not doves in the camps.
If I can jump maybe quickly, absolutely, Mohammed. I think you're right, right? I mean, of course, the refugee camps are not a model of liberal democracy, but I think it's a suspended state, right? It's life in exile, right? You're in the refugee camps, and you're not really thinking about necessarily your freedom of speech, right? Or your, let's say, liberal democratic rights, because what you're thinking about is your struggle for, whatever, independence or returning to Western Sahara one day as a free independent state, right? And the issue, just to return to what Samia was saying, is that you're right about what you're absolutely, Mohammed, but at the same time, it's also true that once, you ask Sahrawis, they, their point is that, it's very easy for them to dismiss autonomy because of the fact that Morocco is not a fully democratic state. So this is a little bit, if you like, the paradox here, right? Their imagination, they see themselves in the future as citizens of a democratic state, even though they don't currently live in one. So they can easily reject the idea of autonomy because they say, well, we're not negotiating autonomy with Spain or the UK. We are actually negotiating autonomy with Morocco, where there are people ending up in jail because of what they wrote on a newspaper, and so on and so forth, right? We know, of course, what the issues are. And I think, in a way, it would really create a paradox, a dilemma for many Sahrawis if Morocco were a completely democratic state and were to offer autonomy to them. That would create a dilemma because that argument would suddenly disappear. And then they would have to seriously contemplate the idea of autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty.
I think we've seen from across the region so many instances where refugees are totally marginalized in the outcome of negotiations and processes that deeply affect them. And the important thing is to ensure that there is not only a political resolution to conflict, but also one that provides social and developmental opportunities for people who are the most affected by it, of course. I want to turn, though, to a question that comes up often by when people talk about Morocco in a regional context, and it's a question that hasn't come up yet in our discussion too much. We've touched on it briefly, but that's the question of Israel and Morocco's relations with Israel. It often seems like this might be a source of friction within the country between a regime which has normalized relations with Israel and a population that might be assumed to be more sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause. Is that the case, or is that a question raised primarily by outsiders? Is this not as sensitive an issue within Morocco as outsiders might assume it would be? Does the question of Israel, again, does it crop up in any of the discussions about protests or criticisms that are coming out more recently?
I mean, I'm happy to sort of tackle this. I mean, I think one thing to sort of preface this, right, is that Morocco's normalization with Israel is very much a formality. I think after decades, right, with the statute of what classified materials are meant to sort of remain out of the public eye, is that Morocco has long been in strong sort of cooperation with Israel. And the largest sort of segment of Jews in Israel outside of Europe are from Morocco. A number of high-ranking Israeli officials are of Moroccan origin. That being said, if you look at within Morocco, one important thing is that over the past few years, I would argue perhaps since 2011, maybe even before, there has been a steady erosion of the capacity to exercise anything close to free speech in Morocco. That applies to ordinary people, whether on social media. It applies to journalists, both foreign and international and local. So the constraints for being able to critique, to engage in these conversations is severely limited. Those that have expressed criticism toward Morocco's normalization with Israel, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, have faced, in some cases, the worst cases, criminal prosecution, charges related to undermining national institutions. So now we're seeing sort of an elevation of this question of critiquing Israel to being on par with other speech-related crimes that the regime usually prosecutes, namely any criticism towards the king, some government officials, and obviously discussing the Western Sahara. So again, that being said, that hasn't stopped necessarily attempts at expressing dissent. Protests have been organized. Most sort of memorably that I can sort of think of off the top of my head was a major effort to prevent the docking of a ship that was intended to deliver weapons to Israel from docking in the Moroccan port. And the BDS movement has also been active in Morocco. Recently, Sian Asidoun, the chapter's founder, passed away, just sort of noting that. So it's, though the absence of a certain sort of view may not be within sight, does not necessarily mean that it's not there. And I think that explains the state of affairs in Morocco across the board.
And yes, I mean, of course, it continues to a thorn in the side of Moroccan, government that they have this normalization, which is not normalization. I mean, it has been the case that there have been really historical ties between the Jewish Moroccans in Israel and Morocco for years. I mean, these trips that, now that they are direct, of course, back from Israel, they've been through Europe, for past. They used to come for Jewish festivals, ceremonies, and traditions. Let's not forget that Morocco itself is, before the Arabs came, 7th, 8th century, I mean, the Jews were there. Jewish diaspora is in Morocco, and there is a long tradition, historical tradition of Jewish Moroccans there. The advisor of the king himself is Jewish. But it does complicate issues for the monarchy, especially after the October 7, attacks, and it puts them in a bind, because they know that their relationship with Israel, normalization, and so on, is a means to an end, and that end, of course, is the Western Sahara. We talk about the Abraham, Accords, and that's why it goes back to my point that this is the issue that matters to the state. The number one perennial foreign policy issue for Morocco. And also it's a matter of national, consensus, right, for Moroccans. So yes, some of them, they feel aggrieved with the normalization. They see what happens in Gaza and so on. But at the same time, some of them, when you talk to Moroccans, they see that the bigger plan here is for Morocco to establish its own control over the Western Sahara and continue on this autonomy plan. Without it, of course, you risk the ire of the United States, the support of the United States, and so on. But there were protests against it. It's not that, completely. I mean, as Samia said, I mean, it's there are protests there. You go to the stadia and whatnot, there are really well-organized chants, against Israel, for Palestine, and so on. It hasn't been. I think it depends on the form and of course and the means for those protests, but it does remain a high state priority to continue on this path, of course, of the Abrahamic Accord. Maybe it's a Faustian deal that the monarchy has entered into, and they realize that. So it does complicate, how they can navigate, the social protestations while committing to their foreign policy that seeks to, of course, bring back the Western Sahara.
And I want to bring it back to the protests to conclude, which is where we began the discussion. The Gen Z 200 protests are, as I understand it, kind of regrouping at the moment, talking on Discord, thinking about what to do with the future. Is there a future for the Gen Z 200 protests? Or are they going to go the way of previous waves of protests that, some of you were talking about, the Harat movement and so forth, which have kind of died out over time? And I wonder whether our expectation that the protests should result in some kind of major upheaval is a kind of subtle way in which we're following this Arab Spring narrative. We kind of expect that protests will eventually lead to some kind of major upheaval, even a regime change. But of course, protests quite often take place at a low level, can be recurrent without really shaking up the system in a fundamental way. I'm not asking you to speculate in the future. I wouldn't ask you to predict that, whether or not you're a political scientist. But what do you think is the most likely outcome of the ongoing protests? Are they simply a recurrent structural feature of Moroccan politics by this point, Or is there a way in which they might actually contribute to meaningful change? Samia, do you want to take that question first, and then
I think
go
that's
around for concluding comments?
It's an incredible question, and it's one that I think all of us are asking. I think as a historian, I'll say that I think what we may expect is that sort of momentum of the Gen Z 212 movement sort of snowballing, building upon that, which was the Hirak, which was February 20th, which was the online boycotts movement, which was Jarada, Imidar, these sort of movements and bursts of discontent kind of snowballing into one another. And we're going to see the next one and the next one, perhaps in greater frequency than before. But I think something that the Gen Z 212 movement opens up in a way that other movements have not really dealt with in a tangible way is how to sort of incorporate the diaspora, of which, right, 11 to 13% of the Moroccan population resides abroad. And I think that if there's any sort of possibility of that shifting, that sort of precedence getting broken, of these movements beginning, bursting, and then kind of waning, is grappling with this question of the diaspora. And that's sort of what I think is going to be something to look out for, especially because, I mean, if we take the World Cup and Morocco's historic performance in the last World Cup performance, you know, like half of the team is from the diaspora. And so there's an interesting parallel there, I think. And perhaps there's something to emulate with Morocco's World Cup successes in the sort of political state of affairs.
Excellent. Thank you, Mohamed.
Again, of course, I mean, with the prediction, much like Samia, we're gonna have these recurring recurring episodes of protest, largely because there's not a political will for meaningful change. As I said, and as I concluded before, there's not a will for meaningful change and to the structure of the government itself, to provide reforms that would deal at some of those socio-political problems. There's not really there's no incentive for the political elite to tackle what Riccardo was talking about, which is the contradiction. I mean, at the heart of this state is this predatory economic capitalistic system that really benefits only the 1-2% in Morocco that are part of the government as well. So the protest, what they do for me is that they won't bring about a change to the regime itself. And I think it would be naive to maintain that or to predict that on my part. But they reshape the priorities at different times for the government. And then the government has to calibrate and deal with some of, symbolically with some of those changes just to placate the population until, of course, we see what happens, with the next ones. But it is an opportunity for reform that is always lost on the government. But it also is fraught with a political risk because for Morocco, as Daniel said and others, it's often seen as this stable, it's a paragon stable nation in North Africa, in the region, and the Middle East in general, the MENA, where there's a wave of protest and so on. But this will cease to be the case, in the future, if you have, multiple episodes of these protests that get violent or as violent as the Gen Z movement. Although I would say that Gen Z protests were peaceful, is the other things that happened in the night, of course, after the Gen Z called for the end of the protest. So if we continue to have these protests in the same way that we had, the last ones in October, I think at some point, Morocco will be seen as a risky country, which will make that whole image, tumble, this economically stable country for investors, for foreign partners and international observers, because I think that's what a lot of times matters for the Moroccan regime and state, unfortunately, not the local population.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Riccardo, your thoughts on the prospects for continuity and change, I guess.
I guess I can only point out to two elements here, right? Two possible issues that probably are worth watching. The first one is, and pretty much as Mohamed has already mentioned, how the government will respond to the protest in terms of policy, right? Because of course there is no intention whatsoever to upset the status quo, or to change what are the basic structures of the political economy of the country. But we know from past experience that usually what the authorities do in the aftermath of a protest movement is to try and address indirectly their concerns, right? And Harakari, for example, was a very interesting example of how that spurred an acceleration in investment in the region, for example. So what will be the concrete practical policy response? What is the room for maneuver for the government to try and satisfy and fulfill these demands? It's probably very limited, but something will have to happen, and that will be, I think, an important thing to watch. And the other thing that I think is important to mention, and I think Samia said this at the beginning, is that this is only the latest incarnation of or embodiment of a longer term, I would say, protest trend in the country, right? And even if this specific protest movement dies down, that doesn't mean that this is over, right? And we will probably face some other form of protest, whether it's like the boycott, the spontaneous boycott of some of the big brands in Morocco that took place a few years ago, or the Hirak, or the 2011 the February 20 movement, and so on and so forth. So I think we should probably look at this not as the protest movement, but as one of the many expressions of an undercurrent of, let's say, dissatisfaction and frustration that the authorities can only respond to indirectly through very limited, let's say, policy resources.
Excellent. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists. Thank you, Samia Errazzouki, Mohamed Daadaoui, and Riccardo Fabiani for contributing to the very rich discussion today. I'd like to thank our viewers at home for joining us. And I'd like to invite you to take a look at our analysis and publications on the region, including Samia's piece on the Gen Z 212 protest that we published this morning. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you